my topic is the challenges that Taiwan faces finding a way forward with the mainland. Stape has touched on a number of those points, so you may hear some duplication. I'll try to edit out as I go through it some of the things that don't need to be repeated. But my apologies if it seems a bit repetitive. I've grouped the problems that she faces in basically three categories. One is the PRC, another is domestic Taiwan politics, and a third is the question of principles. As far as the PRC is concerned, though I believe the PRC trusts that she will not declare independence won't declare independence based on her record, nonetheless they are concerned she will take actions that equate to either soft or cultural or even covert independence, as they've come to call it. They look at her record both in the Li Denghui administration and the Chen Shui-bian administration. So Beijing says both words and actions matter. That is, she has to embrace the mantra, as I call it, of One China, or the 92 Consensus. But she also has to act in a way that is consistent with One China and not say one thing and do another. For a while, it seemed that maybe they would understand she couldn't say One China, and they would look at her actions and say, okay, that's good enough. But in fact, they did not follow through on that kind of idea. They insist that she says there is one China to which both Taiwan and the mainland belong. At one point, actually, it looked like an official said that only actions mattered. But whatever the circumstances and how those statements came to be made, the fact is they have now insisted both on the words and on a program of action that would suit their requirements. Otherwise, Beijing will cut off the relationships that have been developed over the 8 years of the Ma Ying-jeou administration based on mutual acceptance of the 1992 Consensus. Two things to say about that at the outset. One is that Ma's definition, which he shorthanded as One China respective interpretations, never equated to Beijing's. The key thing was it was a One China approach. But his One China was the Republic of China. Of course, that is not true of Beijing. When one looks at whether they, in fact, as Mike indicated, have changed their positions since Xi Jinping and Tsai Ing-wen are sort of looking at each other, Beijing says, no, 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 no. You have to understand that the status quo that has been created in the last several years includes the 1992 Consensus. So by our insisting on it, we're not changing anything. Anybody who might not insist on it and might not accept it, she, just to pick a pronoun, she would be violating the status quo. As Stape mentioned already, Beijing has cut off communication between the two so-called white glove organizations which conduct day-to-day business across the strait, as well as their cabinet-level agencies which had some growing contact. But in fact, one should note that Beijing has not shut down the fax machine. And so when there was a bus accident a few months ago, they were able to receive the information about it, I would say, pretty quickly. But they don't acknowledge the faxes, and they never acknowledged that that transmission of information about the accident, in fact, reopened the line. It was there. A consequence of this situation got involved in what is happening now in Montreal, which is the triennial meeting of the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. Beijing insists as a general matter that any international participation by Taiwan, particularly in UN-related agencies, must do two things. One, it must avoid creating an image of one China, one Taiwan, or two Chinas. And second, it must include consultation between the two sides of the strait to work out what the arrangement is actually going to be. Now, there's an irony here, and that is Tsai Ing-wen actually wants to consult with Beijing, whereas Ma Ying-jeou did not 3 years ago when the issue came up. Taiwan did attend at that time, it was worked out. But in any case, Beijing says, well, the consultation has to go through official channels or quasi-official channels, and we don't have any official consultation going on. So, sorry, we can't do that. In addition, more recently, Beijing has stated pretty directly that any international participation by Taiwan will be circumscribed as long as Taipei does not endorse the 92 consensus or some other form of one China. Some might ask, well, why was Taipei allowed to go to the World Health Assembly, which convened its annual meeting within days of Tsai taking office in May? It was a transitional moment. It was a moment of trying to feel each other out. So I think that when they also looked at her inaugural address, they decided that was okay for that purpose. Let's wait till next year if there hasn't been any improvement. On the inaugural, by the way, the mainland, somewhat haughtily, I would argue, gave Tsai an incomplete grade rather than a failing grade. Well, I'm not sure it's exactly the way I would have liked to see it phrased, but anyway, that's what they did, and that is what allowed WHA to go forward. Another consequence of the circumstance since May 20th is that there is no contact on existing or under negotiation economic agreements or economic contacts. Tourists, for example, Beijing says they have not issued orders to reduce tourists, but there is a dramatic drop, particularly with tourist groups coming from the mainland. Frankly, I find that more than coincidental since this happened since March 20th, or May 20th, excuse me. An official recently, a PRC official recently said that, well, you know, implementation of existing agreements might get a little scraggly as time goes by. They had not talked about that before, although it seemed like a likely result, but now they're even acknowledging it to some extent. There have been efforts, even under the Ma administration, to interfere in Taiwan's negotiations with trading partners of major trade agreements, for example. That is unlikely to stop. Moreover, it's pretty clear that Beijing is not going to be supportive of Taipei joining either the TPP, if there is a TPP, or RCEP, the regional trade agreement, which Beijing is a member of. Stealing a bunch of Taiwan's diplomatic partners would seem another obvious step at some point, and Beijing has already sent a shot across Taipei's bow on this when they established relations with the Gambia some months ago. So this leads us to a second complexity facing her, which is Taiwan's domestic politics. Keep in mind that President Tsai was elected partly, I would argue importantly, against the background of her promise to maintain the status quo. Public opinion in Taiwan has, according to polls, been split about whether this would mean Taiwan would have to accept substantial economic penalties or not. But the basic expectation was that Taiwan would be able, whatever the circumstances, to pick up a reasonable rate of growth, which has not been the circumstance of recent time. But what we see is that that isn't true. That tourism, as I mentioned, is already being hurt, and other sectors are already facing potential growth problems as well. So a number of sectors, including tourism but others, are beginning to put pressure on the President's office to do something about the 1992 consensus issue. I'm sure some people are saying, just go ahead and accept it. And others are not, but they're saying what you've got now won't work. Beijing's policy includes robust statements about maintaining very active ties with the private sector, business sector, farming, fishermen, etc. Now, I believe this presents Beijing with a somewhat of a dilemma. On the one hand, they want to keep a robust relationship with the private sector. On the other hand, they're cutting off communication with government, which is necessary to keep the economic relationship going in a fairly smooth way. We'll have to see how that goes. State mentioned the young people in Taiwan. Beijing knows it's got a problem. It talks about it. It wants to provide inducements for young people to come to the mainland, or even in Taiwan, to have educational support, financial support. I think this is not necessarily going to work very well, because I think young people in Taiwan are separating what they might see as an economic opportunity from political attitudes, where they feel very strongly against unification. And actually, if circumstances were to change, I would say for independence. The one issue of mainland politics that I would mention in this discussion of politics is that as the mainland runs up against the deadline for the 19th Party Congress, with potential implications for leadership selection the next time around, any vulnerability of having been too soft on Taiwan, I think will provide difficulty for Xi Jinping. Within Taiwan, though, the fact is that if Tsai yields on the 92 consensus, she's going to be faced with substantial sellout charges. And I would argue likely demonstrations. You've got a situation where her support numbers are already substantially down since May 20th. And it seems to me that they would continue to drop precipitously, and I don't see that as a likely course. If she does nothing, it's possible relations could stabilize at a lower level of activity. But no one should kid her or himself that there won't be consequences in terms of economic performance in an already depressed situation, and that social harmony will evolve from those who have lived perfectly well under the 92 consensus under Ma Ying-jeou. And some polls show they could do that again. On the issue of principles, just as one ought not to dismiss the PRC's commitment to one China as meaningless rhetoric, one ought not to dismiss President Tsai's commitment to democracy either. Commitment to democracy and governance in accordance with the will of the people, however, does not automatically mean that the 92 consensus has to be rejected. So we'll see how that plays out. In fact, several years ago, a senior DPP official said to me, there are versions of one China we certainly could live with, but they're not the kind that are on offer at this point. And in my view, coming up with a mutually acceptable formula will take decades, including redefinitions of such fundamental concepts as reunification, as one China, as sovereignty. Moreover, Tsai Ing-wen has made it a matter of primary importance not to deprive the people of Taiwan of their choice at the end of the day to decide what the relationship between Taiwan and the mainland should be. And she obviously believes that accepting some form of one China today would do that. Moreover, even though she has made clear that she is president of all the people, not just the DPP membership, and she's not going to represent just the DPP as president, nonetheless, the DPP has some longstanding principles, and she has to be respectful of that fact. In fact, one of the complaints of many or some DPP members is that in pursuing this kind of a presidency, she has been less attentive to DPP principles than to doing what she sees objectively as good for Taiwan. I think what she has done so far, and State mentioned this, has helped to hold off the worst kind of punishments, if you will, from Beijing. They've done the things we've talked about, but the question is how long will Beijing refrain from doing the other things, and how fast will Beijing move once it decides to. I think this is an appropriate place for me to say I don't think there's going to be a security crisis. I don't see any reason for Beijing to lose patience unless she were to be moving toward independence, which I am absolutely convinced she is not going to do. There are a lot of reasons for that. We can discuss it, but I think that she has made very clear that is not her goal or her policy. More than that, she's done things since last June, that is June 2015, with her speech here, and then at various points along the way, including, most important, I would argue, her inaugural address in May, to demonstrate not only is she not going to pursue independence, she's not going to take any steps that are inconsistent with one China. And so there is reason for Beijing to be somewhat cautious about how it moves. Consequences, well, there's a risk, of course, that rather than generating pressure from Beijing's point of view, rather than generating pressure on Tsai to be flexible, that their pressure will create a backlash. That could force her to take a tougher stand and be more belligerent. I don't happen to think so. There are a lot of reasons which we could discuss why she shouldn't do that and why I believe she won't do that. For the United States, most Americans, I think, have been sympathetic to her. They see her taking steps which have been very constructive. And they actually also, I think, tend to approve of not caving into Beijing's demands. That seems to be a rather good thing not to do. At the same time, the U.S. has a dilemma of its own, which is that the U.S. has said it is the responsibility of both sides to come up with a firm basis for continuing the relationship essentially as it has been conducted, and particularly the maintenance of peace and security and stability. That's a call to both sides. The U.S. is not about to tell the two sides how to behave. It's not going to tell the mainland not to pursue one China. It's not going to tell Tsai to pursue one China or accept one China. Let me finish by suggesting one approach, may not work, but that might be considered. If President Tsai were to give some greater respect and understanding to Beijing's commitment to one China in whatever form, including the 92 consensus, I think that would be a good starting point. Not accepting it, but showing some greater respect and understanding. And then Beijing, in turn, were to implement something it's said over many years is its approach, which is that it is firm on principle and flexible on implementation. Neither side would love this approach for obvious reasons, but neither would need to make a compromise on principle, even if, as it takes steps to accommodate the other, they would prefer not to make. Is either side in a position to do that? I have no idea. They have to make that judgment. But it seems to me that in terms of serving the larger interests which State mentioned, rather than rigid adherence and adherence to rhetorical formulations, it may be that an approach like this would be useful, and I think it could help provide a situation where they would have some time to adjust the practical relationships so that they have more confidence in one another and that the future could be more stable. And I think that at least the kind of thinking that lies behind that sort of possible compromise is what people have a right to expect of their leaders. Thank you very much.